Take it away, Peter.
Yeah. So as Dave mentioned, I'll talk about type 1 diabetes. I'm a type 1 diabetic myself. And why should you listen to a type 1 diabetic? Why should you even be interested? Well, the funny thing about type 1 diabetes is you have to inject your own insulin. And by doing so, you see all the sides of the metabolic equation of metabolic health. So you see sugar and carbohydrate intake, protein intake, all those things. You see what it does to your blood glucose, and you see how much insulin you have to inject. And in that way, you are, although it's not very nice to have a type 1 diabetes, you're in a very special position because you see exactly how much insulin you need to metabolize food. And yeah, that's for type 1 diabetics very interesting because mainstream recommendations are to eat a lot of carbohydrates and that sort of things, basically to follow a standard diet almost for diabetics. And the whole problem with diabetes is that you can't metabolize carbohydrates. So you have to inject insulin in my case, or you have to take medicine in the case of type 2 diabetes, or you have to do something about your diet and try to reverse or minimize the effects of type 2 diabetes, for example. But that's not what's being told in the mainstream medicine. They'll tell you to follow standard diets, eat enough carbohydrates, and eat enough times during the days, and also include snacks to balance out your blood glucose. So they focus all on the blood glucose, but it is in the end about insulin and the fact that you can't metabolize carbohydrates and glucose especially. So that's, in my opinion, where you have to go and look as a type 1 diabetic, but also as a normal person. If you don't have diabetes, you should try to minimize insulin. And of course, you can have a few insulin spikes during the day. That's actually very healthy. But a lot of spikes aren't good because every time that you get an insulin spike, every time that you eat, you'll get inflammation. And if you eat 3 times a day and you include snacks every time in between, your body will be constantly inflamed. You get insulin, which is also a fat storage hormone. You get sugar rises and dips. You'll get hungry because your insulin is elevated, all those things. And for me, a lot of things changed because I'm a type 1 diabetic for 16 years and I did reasonably well, also according to doctors. My HbA1c was already at 5.6 10 years ago, for example. But I feel like crap because during the day, my average was okay, but it would go up and down, the sugar. And of course, I also followed the advice of eating enough, correcting my blood glucose with carbohydrates. And I was feeling lousy and it was disrupting my daily life. And about 2 or 3 years ago, I came across the ideas of Dr. Bernstein. And every diabetic and also non-diabetic should at least look up a video of him. And if you have some more time, do read his book, The Diabetes Solution. And he talks about the law of small numbers. And basically, that's very insightful, not just for us, but for anybody. The whole idea of low-carb diets and human-appropriate diets is basically to lower carbohydrates and lower all the variations during the day. You'll have stable energy, all those things. And that's the way humans should eat. So you shouldn't eat, for example, 100 grams of carbohydrates in a meal and do that 3 times a day. So in order to keep your diabetes under control, I think the very minimum, even if you don't go low carb, because my name is the Dutch Carnivore, that's only because I'm on a carnivore diet. But in my opinion, you can also go low carb, keto, ketovore, even medium carb if you're active and if you don't have troubles with autoimmune issues and that sort of things. You can also go to 100 grams of carbs a day if you're a very active person. And you'll be able to keep your diabetes under control because this law of small numbers tells you that if you eat small amounts of sugar, especially if you avoid sugar and you replace it with protein, you'll get low inputs and you can correct it with small amounts of insulin and also with slower insulin. And what happens on a sugar-rich diet is you have to match very steep peaks of short duration of glucose. You have to match them also with the peaks of the ultra-rapid insulin. And in the 20th century, they invented this ultra-rapid insulin analogs, basically to deal with extreme cases of type 2 diabetes, very carb-rich diets, all just to cover those extremely huge insulin spikes, glucose spikes. And that's just going in the opposite direction of where we should go. So treating diabetes is about lowering the insulin and, of course, in the case of type 1 diabetes, to match the insulin with the requirements, but not to overload your body with a lot of insulin. That's not just healthy in a blood glucose management way, but insulin is also anabolic, and it can have effects on cancer growth, even that sort of things. So there is no reason why you should have a hyperinsulinemic state in your body. That's the thing. And actually, I would go that far that if you're a diabetic, it's more important to lower insulin than have perfect blood glucose control. So if your A1C is a 5.5, which is around the upper limit, but you have very good control, that is better than being on an A1C of 4.5 and having to inject loads of insulin to get to that point. You should only get to that point by a proper diet, basically. And yeah, that's a proper diet means also so low in carbohydrates, and don't get fooled by the ideas of the standard diet that you should go for low glycemic foods, for example, because I tried all those things in the past. And I think many carnivores and many ketoers and all of us have tried all these false friends, let's say, of high fiber foods, low glycemic foods, adding in supplements, because with diabetes you have those as well. You can take cinnamon, for example, and they tell you that your blood glucose control will improve. But in the end, you try it for some weeks and it never works. And low glycemic foods, it's the same story. They might give you the idea that it works a little bit, but why does it work? Because you switch from white bread to lentils, for example. Well, there are two different things about it. White bread is hyper palatable, so you'll eat a lot. If you switch to lentils, you'll eat far less. You will not combine it with who knows what, ketchup and all the nice things that you can have with the white bread. So it's all confusing stuff. And fiber as well. If I get a type 1 diabetic that asks me for advice when they are just diagnosed, I actually will tell them that if they eat carbs, they should stick, for example, to simple carbs like potatoes. So I'm not recommending high carb diets, of course, but you stick to potatoes instead of going to salads and lentils and all these fibers, because fiber is highly unpredictable. So it sounds very nice. And if you're fine-tuning, if you're an expert, you might utilize it in some ways. But in the end, they are all confounders. And that made me very mad as a diabetic in the past. So I've been doing all these things for 10 years. And this I try to advise now to diabetics is you have to minimize all the variation in your life, in your diet. So that comes to the low carb and the low insulin, of course, but also variations in lifestyle. So I try to avoid eating 3 to 4 hours before sleeping. And you hear this a lot also in the carnivore community. It's not good to have your body and your digestive system running while sleeping. I actually would feel warm even if I do so. But for diabetics, of course, that's really problematic because you'll have to rely on your CGM and wake up and inject insulin halfway the night and all those things. And the funny thing is, a lot of the things in the carnivore diet community, I already did as a diabetic before starting. And that are things like fasting, intermittent fasting. They are just perfect because if you want a simple hack to improve your diabetes and your metabolic health, your blood glucose control is get the blood glucose levels during sleep in order, skip a meal so that during the entire morning your blood glucose flatlines and your insulin levels are low. and yeah, those things in the mainstream recommendations, you don't get to hear them, because diabetics are advised to eat all day, because doctors are, of course, afraid of hypoglycemia and that sort of things. And yeah, that's in my opinion the most important thing for diabetes, to reduce all the dynamics in daily life. And yeah, maybe one final note. That's a question I get a lot. When people consider going low carb or keto, then from doctors they'll hear that it's risky and that they need to take precautions to prevent diabetic ketoacidosis. And I'll actually argue that going low carb and having better blood glucose control will help you to prevent ketoacidosis, because the whole problem, when you look around on social media, especially on TikTok, you'll see all the diabetics eating high carb diets. And if they forget to inject insulin, they'll get a sugar spike, of course. But for them, it's normal to see those sugar spikes on a daily basis sometimes. So they will not consider the possibility that it might also be caused by the fact that insulin is missing, because that's the leading cause of diabetes, the diabetic ketoacidosis. So you will see very often people going to the hospital with hyperglycemic DKA of like 300 milligrams per deciliter. But that doesn't happen on a low carb diet. If my blood glucose goes towards 180, 200, I need to see very good reasons that it goes there. So in extreme cases that I do eat some carbs. But otherwise, for me, that's an urgent reminder that I should check my ketones. And so far, this actually has never happened. Because, yeah, if any anomaly occurs on a low-carb diet, everything is smooth and steady. And, yeah, you see everything immediately.